The frontier wire was a 271 kilometers obstacle in Italian Libya, along the length of the border of British-held Egypt, running from El Ramleh, in the Gulf of Sollum south of Jaghbub, parallel to the 25th meridian east, the Libya-Egypt and Libya-Sudan borders. The frontier wire and line of covering forts were built by the Italians during the Second Italo-Senussi War, as a defensive system to contain the Senussi population who crossed from Egypt during the resistance against the Italian colonizers. For the Italian declaration of war on 10 June 1940 to late 1942, it was the scene of military engagements between Italian, British and German forces as the fighting ebbed and flowed across the frontier. Background: in 1922, Benito Mussolini continued the reconquista of Libya in the Second Italo-Senussi War. The frontier wire was built by the Italian army under the command of General Rodolfo Graziani in the early 1930s, as a means to repress Senussi resistance against the Italian colonization by hindering the movement of Senussi fighters and materials from Egypt. The wire comprised 4 lines of 1.7 meters high stakes in concrete bases laced with barbed wire 320 kilometers long, just inside the border from El Ramleh on the Gulf of Sollum, past Fort Capuzzo to Sidi Omar, then south, slightly to the west of the 25th meridian east, the border with Egypt and Sudan. 3 large forts at Amsid, Sega and Jaghbub, and 6 smaller ones at El Ramleh on the Gulf of Sollum, Sidi Omar, Cefazan, Vesache, Garnal Green, and El Armara were built along the wire. The wire was patrolled using aircraft and armored cars from the forts by the Italian army and border guards, who attacked anyone seen in the frontier zone. Prelude: frontier skirmishes. British patrols closed up to the frontier wire on the 11th of June 1940 and began to dominate the area, harass the garrisons of the frontier forts and set ambushes along the Via Littorania Libica and inland tracks. Some Italian troops were unaware that war had been declared and 70 were captured during the day on the track to Sidi Omar. British patrols ranged north to the Via Littorania Libica on the coast between Bardia and Tobruk, west to Bir El Gubi and south to Jaghbub. Italian reinforcements then arrived at the frontier, began to reconnoiter, improved the frontier defenses and recaptured Fort Capuzzo. On the 13th of August, the British raids were stopped to conserve the serviceability of vehicles, and the support group of the 7th Armored Division took over to observe the wire for 97 kilometers from Sollum south to Fort Maddalena and be ready to fight delaying actions against an Italian advance. Fort Capuzzo was one of the forts built near the border with Egypt and the frontier wire, part of a system of frontier control built in the early 1930s. The Via Littorania Libica ran south from Bardia to Fort Capuzzo, 13 kilometers west of the port of Sollum in Egypt, then east across the frontier, down the escarpment to the coast. The fort was built with 4 crenellated stone walls around a yard, with living quarters on the edges. A track ran south from the fort is just west of the frontier wire and the border to Sidi Omar, Fort Maddalena and Jaghbub. On the 14th of June, after the Italian declaration of war on Britain 4 days earlier, the 7th Hussars and elements of the 1st Royal Tank Regiment, Gladiators of 33 Squadron Royal Air Force and Blenheims of 211 Squadron captured Fort Capuzzo, as the 11th Hussars took Fort Maddalena about 60 miles further south. The fort was not occupied long, for lack of troops and equipment, but demolition parties visited each night to destroy Italian ammunition and vehicles. The Italians reoccupied Fort Capuzzo and held it with part of the 2nd Black Shirt Division. On the 29th of June, the Maletti Group repulsed British tanks with its artillery and then defeated a night attack During the frontier skirmishes from the 11th of June to the 9th of September, the British claimed to have inflicted 3,500 casualties for a loss of 150 men. On the 16th of December, during Operation Compass, the 4th Armoured Brigade of the Western Desert Force captured Sidi Omar and the Italians withdrew from Sollum, Fort Capuzzo and the other frontier forts. No. 9 Field Supply Depot was established at the fort for the 7th Armored Division. Sidi Omar. The fortified camp at Sidi Omar was ringed with barbed wire, trenches and minefields. On the 11th of June 1940, the 11th Hussars in Rolls-Royce and Morris CS-9 armored cars closed up to the frontier wire, crossed during the night and exchanged fire with the garrison at Sidi Omar. Sidi Omar was captured on the 16th of December during Operation Compass by the 7th Hussars, 2nd Royal Tank Regiment and the 4th Royal Horse Artillery. After a bombardment, the British tanks charged the fort. One broke through the wall and after another tank drove through the hole, the garrison began to surrender. The Italians had concentrated the firepower on the east wall facing Egypt and had been surprised by an attack from the west. The fall of the fort left the way clear for the British to send reinforcements and supplies to the forces further north on the coast, free from the possibility of attack from the inland flank. Jaghbub. On the 16th of June 1940, 2 days after the loss of Fort Capuzzo and Fort Maddalena and 6 days after the Italian declaration of war, the 10th Army formed Raggruppamento with orders to end British penetrations of the frontier wire near Fort Capuzzo. The Raggruppamento comprised a Libyan motorized battalion from the 1st Libyan Division Sibyl, the 3rd Company of the IX Light Tank Battalion with 16 times L3 33rd Tankettes and the motorized Libyan 17th Battery IV Group with 4 times 77 28th guns. Raggruppamento was sent from Jaghbub towards the area from Sidi Omar - Fort Capuzzo to clear the area of British raiding parties. As Raggruppamento advanced toward Fort Capuzzo in 2 columns, British forces in the vicinity were ordered to withdraw across the border. 2 11th Hussar armored cars attacked the Italian column at Jaghbub, about 18 miles west of Sidi Omar, on a plain devoid of cover, along the route of the smaller Italian column. Divanzo formed a defensive square, with the 4 guns at the corners, the infantry along the sides and the 12 L3 light tanks patrolling outside. The British reinforced the 11th Hussars with the 7th Hussars armoured cars and a mixed force of light tanks, a cruiser squadron of cruiser Mki tanks and an artillery battery. The Italian tanks charged forward ahead of the artillery and infantry and were knocked out. The British then circled the Italian square, firing at the lorries and infantry, and after the second circuit, the Italian artillery opened fire. The Italian gunners had only high explosive ammunition and the British concentrated on the guns at each corner. Lacking cover, the Italian gunners were soon shot down and then the infantry broke. The British destroyed 12 light tanks, the 4 guns and killed or captured 100 of the 400 Italian infantry. Fort Maddalena, a squadron of the 11th Hussars made 3 gaps in the wire on the night of the 11th of June, cut telephone poles on the Italian side and skirmished around the fort. On the 13th of June, an armored car troop attacked the fort and was repulsed by the garrison, then attacked by aircraft as they retreated. The 11th Hussars reconnoitred again on the 14th of June with part of the 4th Armoured Brigade ready to attack, but the garrison surrendered, the British taking 18 prisoners and destroying equipment, then moving on to set an ambush on the Via Littorale near Libica. Siege of Jaghbub. The Siege of Jaghbub in Libya took place between the WDF and Italian forces. In the aftermath of Operazione the invasion of Libya by the Italian 10th Army, Operation Compass by the WDF, the Battle of Sidi Barrani and the pursuit of the 10th Army into Cyrenaica, the fortified Italian position at the Jaghbub oasis was besieged by parts of the 6th Australian Division from December 1940 to the 21st of March 1941. The 6th Australian Divisional Cavalry Regiment began the siege in December 1940 and isolated the oasis, leaving the garrison dependent on the Regia Aeronautica for supplies. Air transport proved insufficient and hunger prompted many of the locally recruited troops to desert. After being reinforced by the 9th Australian Battalion and a battery of the 4th RA, the Australians attacked and captured Jaghbub from 17 to 21 March 1941. The Australians left behind a salvage party and withdrew from the oasis the next day, just before Operation Sonnenblume, an Italo-German counter-offensive which recaptured Cyrenaica. Post-war, after the Allied conquest in 1943, Tripolitania and Cyrenaica were ruled under the British military administration of Libya until independence in 1951. As a kingdom under Muhammad Idris bin Muhammad al-Mahdi as Senussi in the frontier wire disappeared into obscurity. Order of battle.